Franks, one of the most fascinating and powerful groups to shape European history. Imagine a people who started out as a loose bunch of tribes along the lower Rhine River, and went on to build a kingdom so influential that it defined Europe for centuries, especially under the legendary Charlemagne. Sounds incredible, right? Well, let's break it all down. The Franks were a Germanic people who lived beyond the Rhine River, a natural boundary that the Romans saw as the edge of their civilized world. On the other side of that river? Chaos, or so the Romans thought. These Germans were stereotyped as wild, tall, and fearless, a stark contrast to the orderly world of Rome. For a long time, Roman legions held their ground, keeping Germanic tribes at bay. But as the Roman Empire began to falter, cracks appeared. By the 3rd century, the Franks started showing up in history, not as one united group but as a collection of tribes banding together when it suited them. They were like a swarm, unpredictable, yet undeniably powerful. The name Frank itself meant the fierce, or the brave, a badge of honor that later evolved to mean the free, reflecting how they saw themselves. Now, these tribes weren't all the same. Some you might have heard of, like the Salians and Ripuarians, ended up becoming the most prominent among them. But where did they come from? That's a bit of a mystery. Some stories, like those from Gregory of Tours, claim they originated in Pannonia, now Hungary, and moved westward. Others tie their origins to legends as grand as the Trojan War, with tales of Trojan refugees founding cities and eventually becoming the Franks. While these myths were likely invented to give the Franks a glorious backstory comparable to Rome's, modern historians believe the Franks probably didn't migrate far at all. They likely emerged right there along the Rhine. Before Christianity, the Franks had their own rich mythology. They worshipped a variety of gods, with special reverence for nature. Forests, animals, and even water had sacred significance. Gregory of Tours, who was a Christian bishop, painted their old religion as primitive, claiming they worshipped idols made from the creatures around them. One fascinating symbol for them was the bull. It wasn't just any animal, it had a mythical connection to their leaders, with tales of a sea beast called the Quinator, fathering one of their early kings. How cool is that? Language and law were also huge parts of Frankish identity. Originally speaking a Germanic dialect, the Franks began to mix with local populations when they moved into areas like Belgium and Gaul, leading to a blending of languages. This cultural melting pot shaped the roots of languages we know today, like Old Dutch and Old French. On the legal side, the Franks had a unique system where each tribe followed its own rules, passed down orally by a law speaker. But when King Clovis I came into power in the late 5th century, he laid the groundwork for unity by creating a written law code called Salic law. It was a big deal at the time, focusing on inheritance and justice, and its impact lasted for generations. And now let's talk about how the Franks went from fierce raiders to key players in shaping Europe's history. By the late 3rd century, the Franks were already making waves, or rather causing chaos, on Roman soil. They weren't just attacking by land, they were bold enough to take to the seas, with Frankish pirates even raiding far-off places like North Africa. Imagine the audacity of that. The Romans had no choice but to respond. Over the years, they launched campaign after campaign to push back the Franks. Sometimes it worked, like when Emperor Maximian forced King Genebaud to surrender in 289. But the Franks kept coming back, relentless and unyielding. The relationship between the Franks and Rome wasn't always about conflict, though. In some cases, Rome got creative with its enemies. Rather than executing captured Franks, they settled them on Roman land. These people, called laeti, were given land in exchange for military service. By the 4th century, entire tribes, like the Salian Franks, were being allowed to settle in Belgic Gaul, while others, like the Ripuarians, were placed around Cologne. Over time, these former foes became allies, protecting Rome's borders and even joining the Roman army. Some Franks managed to climb the ranks of Roman society, taking on positions of power. Names like Melibodes and Arbogast stand out. men who became generals, consuls, and even, in Arbogast's case, de facto rulers of the Western Roman Empire. But let's be real, this wasn't the case for all Franks. Many still opposed Rome, launching attacks under leaders like Suno and Marcomer. Even so, by the mid-5th century, the lines between the Franks and Romans had blurred. They were fighting side by side, most famously at the Battle of the Catalaunian Fields in 451, where they helped stop the Huns. But as Rome's grip on Gaul weakened, it left a power vacuum that ambitious Frankish leaders were eager to fill. This is where the Salian Franks really began to shine. Offering protection and stability to local populations, they started building their own power base in northeastern Gaul. Under King Childeric I, they became the dominant force among the Frankish tribes, setting the stage for his son Clovis IC to take things to a whole new level. Clovis didn't just take over Gaul, he reshaped it. In 486, he defeated the last vestige of Roman power in the region by crushing Syagrius at the Battle of Soissons. From there, he expanded his kingdom, defeating the Alemanni, the Visigoths, and the Burgundians, consolidating Frankish dominance. But perhaps the most significant move of his reign was his conversion to Christianity around 496. This wasn't just a personal spiritual decision, it was a game-changer politically. By adopting Catholicism, Clovis aligned himself with the powerful Roman Church, distancing the Franks from Arian Christianity, which was practiced by many of their rivals. This gave the Franks a unique edge, cementing their place as protectors of the Catholic faith in Western Europe. Clovis wasn't shy about consolidating his power either. Toward the end of his life, he eliminated rival Frankish kings and united the Franks under one rule. By the time he died in 511, Clovis was king of all the Franks, having built a kingdom that spanned nearly all of Gaul. His legacy, though, came with complications. He divided his kingdom among his 4 sons, a decision that led to cycles of infighting and fragmentation. Still, they managed to expand their influence, conquering territories like Burgundy, and even venturing into Spain and Italy. Over time, the Merovingian dynasty Clovis founded became the largest and most powerful successor state to the Roman Empire. But the unity he built didn't last. After Clothar I briefly reunited the kingdom in 558. His death 3 years later sparked a new wave of divisions, with the Frankish lands splitting into Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy. What followed was a messy saga of civil wars, power struggles, and ruthless rivalries, particularly between 2 queens, Brunhilde and Fredegund, who used their families as pawns in their quest for dominance. The feud dragged on for decades, filled with betrayals, assassinations, and battles, until Brunhilde's defeat and brutal execution in 613. By then, Clothar II had emerged victorious, uniting the Franks once more. But this unity came at a cost. To secure his rule, Clothar had to give significant power to the Frankish nobility, essentially trading royal authority for peace. These concessions weakened the Merovingian kings, setting the stage for their decline. By the time Clothar's son Dagobert I took the throne, he was the last of the Merovingians to wield any real power. After his death in 639, the kings became little more than figureheads, earning the nickname Do-Nothing Kings as the true power shifted to their mayors of the palace. And by 687, power within the Frankish kingdoms had started to shift decisively. The Kingdom of Austrasia emerged as the dominant force, defeating Neustria and Burgundy at the Battle of Tetri. Behind Austrasia's rise was an ambitious aristocratic family known as the Pippinids, or sometimes the Arnulfings. These guys were more than just political players. They had been mayors of the palace in Austrasia for generations, going all the way back to the days of Dagobert I. But here's the catch. Even though they essentially ran the show, they couldn't claim the throne. The Franks, steeped in tradition, weren't ready to accept a new dynasty just yet. That all began to change with Charles Martel, a key figure in Frankish history. Born around 688, Charles was a member of the Pippinid clan, who became mayor of the palace in 715. If you've heard his name before, it's probably because of the Battle of Tours in 732. Charles led the Franks to victory over the Umayyad Caliphate, stopping their advance into Western Europe. This wasn't just a military win, it cemented his reputation as the true power in Francia. By the time his nominal king, Theodoric IV, died in 737, Charles didn't even bother installing a new one. For the rest of his life, the throne stayed empty, a clear sign that the Merovingian dynasty had become little more than a formality. After Charles's death in 741, his sons brought back a Merovingian figurehead to avoid rocking the boat too much. But the days of Merovingian power were over. In 751, Charles' son Pepin the Short decided it was time to make things official. With the backing of Pope Zachary, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king and crowned himself. This marked the start of the Carolingian dynasty, a new chapter in Frankish history. Pepin's reign was relatively short. He died in 768, but his legacy was profound. He divided his lands between his two sons, Charlemagne I and Charles. For a few years they ruled as co-kings, but in 771, Charlemagne's sudden death left Charles as the sole ruler. History remembers him as Charlemagne, one of the most influential figures of the Middle Ages. From his court in Aachen, Charlemagne led a life of nearly constant warfare, expanding his realm far beyond its original borders. He conquered the Lombards in 774, adding northern Italy to his kingdom, and took on enemies as diverse as the Avars in Hungary, the Saracens in Spain, and the Saxons in what is now Germany. The Saxon Wars, in particular, defined much of Charlemagne's reign. Spanning more than 3 decades, these brutal campaigns were about more than just land. Charlemagne sought to Christianize the pagan Saxons, often by force. Despite the resistance, he ultimately succeeded, bringing Saxony into his empire. By the end of his reign, Charlemagne had doubled the size of the Frankish kingdom. On Christmas Day in 800, Pope Leo III crowned him as Holy Roman Emperor, a move that symbolized a new era. While the title boosted the prestige of both Charlemagne and the Carolingians, it was also a power play by the papacy, aiming to bind Charlemagne's authority to the church. His empire, later known as the Carolingian Empire, became a cultural and political center of Western Europe, even sparking the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning, art, and culture. Charlemagne's empire was vast, stretching from northern Spain to Hungary, but it didn't last long after his death in 814. His only surviving son, Louis the Pious, inherited the throne. Louis tried to maintain unity, but after his death in 840, his empire was divided among his sons into East, Middle, and West Francia. This division marked the beginning of the end for the Carolingian dynasty, but it also laid the groundwork for the future nations of Germany, France, and Italy. By this point, the term Franks had evolved. It was no longer tied to a single ethnic group, but was used more broadly to describe Western Europeans, particularly during the Crusades. Crusaders from across Western Europe were often called Franks, or Latins, by Eastern Christians and Muslims, a testament to the enduring influence of the Frankish legacy. And that brings us full circle. The Franks, once a loose confederation of tribes along the Rhine, rose to dominate Western Europe. From defeating Rome's armies to building an empire that rivaled it, their story is one of transformation, power, and legacy. They weren't just barbarians who replaced Rome. They became the architects of a new Europe,